Hello everybody, I'm Andy Agathangelou, the founder of the Transparency Task Force. I'm delighted to have you all with us. We're covering a particularly important topic today, the case for radical corporate governance reform. And what's driven the idea behind this event is the ongoing calamity we seem to have in terms of keeping our companies on the straight and narrow. Of course, the vast majority of organizations keep themselves aligned with the kind of ethics and values that everybody would expect. But there's no doubt about it that from time to time, we really do have catastrophic corporate governance failure, which leads to all kinds of harm for the public, the shareholders, and all the other stakeholders involved with those organizations. So this, we believe, is a topic of great importance to, of course, not just the Transparency Task Force community, but also all kinds of stakeholders around the world. We have an exceptionally strong lineup of speakers today: Professor Adam Lever, Professor Gerhard Schnyder, Dr. Shan Turnbull, Krzysztof Grabowski, and Josina Kamerling. We really do have a dream team of subject matter experts here to talk today about this topic, the case for radical corporate governance reform. We do also have a few individuals with us today who are brand new to the Transparency Task Force community. So I'm going to spend a few moments just covering what is the TTF question so that everybody's on the same page. The Transparency Task Force is a British-based but very international certified social enterprise. That phrase, certified social enterprise, simply means that we exist not to make a profit, but to make an impact. And we are working very hard, very hard, to try to make an impact, particularly in relation to the workings of the financial services sector. Our mission, and this is word for word correct, our mission is to promote ongoing reform of the financial services sector so that it serves society better. We operate through 25 groups. You can think of the Transparency Task Force as being a cluster of 25 mini campaign organizations. The one that is most relevant to today's symposium is our group called Governance, Culture and Conduct. We think there's a very close connection between those three words. Good governance will drive out good culture and lead to good conduct. So that's essentially what the Transparency Task Force is all about. Today's symposium, like all of our symposia, is being recorded. As soon as we can, we'll edit the session and get it out there on social media. When you're aware that the session has been produced and is edited, please do all you can to raise awareness of it through your own social media channels. We don't have a penny to spend on PR, marketing, advertising, promotion. Everything we do through the Transparency Task Force is driven by the goodwill within our community. I'll spend a few moments talking about the community itself. Our community tends to be made up of people who have what I call a stand up rather than stand by mindset. In other words, the approximately 3,500 people who are part of the Transparency Task Force, they tend to be people who care. They tend to be people who are bothered enough to do something about the problems that we encounter. And as a consequence, we believe we are developing a truly powerful international network that is, without a doubt, a force for good. The last main point I'll say before we invite Professor Adam Lever to speak is to simply explain that the Transparency Task Force is much more than simply a talking shop. We are doing a great deal of many things to drive change in the market. Our strategy for driving change is about bringing together the thinking of two types of people. On one hand, there are those that we characterize as having a sense of passion and purpose for the change that we want to see. And on the other hand, those that we characterize as having the power and the position to make change possible. So we dream up all kinds of ways to influence the people that control the way the system works. And just to think of today as an example, um, earlier this morning, I was having a very important conversation with a key parliamentarian in our space, along with one of our members, talking about reforms. And I'm also very proud to say that I gave evidence to Parliament this afternoon, I think the second time in about 3 or 4 weeks, about the issue of phoenixing. Phoenixing, as I'm sure you're aware, is where directors deliberately close down a company, pop up somewhere else with a different company name, and carry on doing the dodgy things they were doing before. It's a major problem. And there I was having a chance to speak to parliamentarians at a special hearing talking about the idea that it should be possible for the enforcement agencies to prosecute directors who have been criminally active, so that they cannot simply get out of jail by phoenixing their companies. It would be a major reform for the UK if that were to happen, especially if they were to make the new laws retrospective, which is something I expressed my support for. So that's essentially the Transparency Task Force. I hope that gives everybody a bit of a feel for what we're all about. My final comment before we pass over to Professor Adam Lever is to simply mention that we try to use social media as much as we can. And with that in mind, I've just put into the chat our social media, our Twitter handle, as you call it, a Twitter handle. Please do tweet away if you wish to. I've got more to say, but I'll wait for the moment to do that later on. What I'd like to do right now, please, is invite Adam Lever to take the stage, so to speak. Adam, over to you, sir. Thank you very, very much for being with us. We've only got to know you, Adam, over a relatively short period of time, but you are most definitely somebody who's on our wavelength. Adam, over to you. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andy and TTF, for inviting me to present today. What I wanted to talk about today was not necessarily the illegal things that companies can do, but the quite legal things that companies have been doing since the financial crisis of 2008, and how some of the governance arrangements that we see should trouble us. So. Really, I'm going to focus on the issue of shareholder primacy and of fair value accounting, and the way in which this is creating some quite unusual pathological distributional practices that we're seeing in some firms. So really, today I want to just talk about how shareholder primacy the shareholder primacy governance model and the fair value accounting regime has facilitated some what I would consider, and I think you will too when you see the data, some unsustainable distributional practices by some of our largest listed corporations. So what we find in a nutshell is that the highest distributing companies that we have in the FTSE 350 are characterized by weak productivity and investment growth, weak operating performance, higher leverage, and a greater propensity to be intangible, to hold lots of goodwill on their balance sheet. So to understand all this, there's two relevant factors. One is to understand how accounting rules have enabled this kind of behavior and an almost kind of dislocation of distributions to shareholders from underlying profit in some cases, and a weakening of the legal capital rules, which are supposed to protect creditors and put a floor effectively under what can be distributed. So I'll go through this pretty quickly. The salient point here is that over the last 20 years, we've seen a change to the accounting regime. We've moved from a more historic cost regime where we valued things generally on the basis of the prices that we paid for them historically, and we've moved towards a more forward-looking, future-oriented measurement regime. So that was partly introduced because we saw an encroachment, if you want me to use the pejorative, of financial economics as a kind of an expert knowledge into the realm of accounting, which legitimized a shareholder primacy approach, basically said shareholders own the firm, so it is the duty of the directors to produce information that is relevant to shareholders or relevant for shareholders to make buy, hold, sell decisions. So this pivoted the whole accounting regime away from a historic cost valuation towards a future-oriented fair value regime, which looked at increasingly used capital market-like valuations. So you used expectations about your discounted cash flows to value many of your assets, for example. The sum total of this is this kind of undermined the concept of realization, the idea that you need some cash there alongside your profit if you're going to be able to distribute. It also paradoxically really increased subjectivity and managerialized a lot of the production of accounting information. If you are trying to value things based on your expectations of future cash flows, it does increase discretion and subjectivity. And of course, this then empowered the consulting arms of the Big Four, who advise on how best to represent your economic activity efficiently. Now, you might think that this kind of slightly more subjective way of kind of booking asset prices and profit might mean that might lead to kind of a complete crisis of over distributions. But there is always this legal regime, the capital maintenance regime, which is designed to prevent over distributions and to protect creditor interests. But to an extent, that has also been watered down. The Companies Act of 2006 tried to put continued the tradition of putting a legal limit on what could be distributed, and that was equivalent to the net assets that exceed the paid-in capital plus other undistributable reserves, like your share premium account, your merger reserve, and so on. But crucially, it delegated the definition of what was realizable and thus distributable to the accounting bodies. And the latest version of that is the ICAW technical guidance to distributions that I've listed there. Just to sum things up pretty quickly, there's 3 key points here, which is that what can be distributed to shareholders is determined on an accruals, not a cash basis. So that means I can agree to sell something but not receive the cash. I can borrow against that and pay out to shareholders legally. I can permit some fair value revaluations and again borrow against that, and those would be distributable against. I could borrow against that and I could pay that out. And crucially, the distributable reserves are set at the parent company level, not the group level. And this creates lots of opportunities to overload subsidiaries and to over-distribute. So what does this mean in terms of distributional practices? I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour through some data, which comes from a report we released last week, in fact. So you can see that the top 20% of the highest distributing firms in the FTSE 350, it's actually FTSE 182 because we discounted all the firms where we couldn't get complete data. The highest distributors, so that is share buybacks and dividends relative to your net income, your group net income, that is, paid out 178% of their profits between 2009 and 2019. So they are paying out more to shareholders than they're generating in profit over a long period of time. Some of that is skewed by some extraordinarily high distributors, but the marginal firm is still over 100%. So you've got 20% of the FTSE 350 paying out more to shareholders than they generate in profit over a 10-year period there. This is not unusual. It's comparable with other indexes. So we see the same thing in the S&P 500. We see the same in the Euro Stoxx 350 and 500. But what we also find then is, how do they perform? Is it that these are just, is there something about these firms that they anticipate, solid performance in the future or have a historic track record of that? Well, actually, what we find is that the highest distributing firms, so we rank them from the highest to the lowest and then cut them into quintiles and then use those as consistent groups. actually have lower real sales per employee growth. So that's one measure of profitability, productivity. So they've got declining productivity, in fact, by that measure. Lower real value added per employee growth. So again, these are high distributing firms with declining rates of productivity growth. They have lower real capital expenditure per employee growth. So again, the amount that they're investing is declining. They generally have weaker operating performance than the rest. So again, what we see here is that average net income to sales and net income to capital employed are lower than the rest of the 350. They tend to be more highly geared, so they have got more debt relative to their equity, and they are more intangible. So this can be pretty risky because much of the intangibles are goodwill and they are prone to impairments. And we've seen many examples of firms moving from kind of relatively healthy financial positions to very unhealthy positions when they have to impair a great big chunk of their goodwill. So this just illustrates that point. You can see that the number of companies where a 20% goodwill write-down will reduce their net income by over 50% were 20 in the top quintile. So, and in total, that would be round about, over half of the top quintile would have their net income impaired by 50%. And if you impaired all of your goodwill, it would completely wipe out shareholder equity in just under 2/5 of the firms in this top quintile. Okay, so what does this tell us about governance? Well, clearly something's a bit awry because we've got a significant minority of firms, a rump of high distributing, low productivity, low investment, weak performing, indebted, intangible firms in the FTSE 350. And clearly this poses a risk. There's a lot of employment there. There's a lot of pension fund money stacked into these companies. And it seems to me there is a material risk here. We need a governance regime that better balances stakeholder interests. We need an accounting regime that takes away the punch bowl from firms who are leaning on financial engineering and creative accounting to make these excessive distributions. And we need them to do the more difficult stuff of management, like running their operations more efficiently. We need a capital maintenance regime that creates greater resilience and prevents this kind of behavior and provides the necessary buffers for stakeholders. And we need an auditing regime that reinforces the protection of firm capital. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. I can provide a link to the paper in the chat if anyone is interested.
Adam, thank you very, very much indeed. Can we all prepare ourselves for a quick sort of Q&A discussion round? So, Adam, could I just ask you, you touched on the audit profession and the role it has in governance. What are your general thoughts, please, Adam, about the importance of the audit profession doing its job properly to help companies stay on the straight and narrow? I always get the general impression that audits aren't really audits, and the industry tends to duck and dive when it's challenged about the credibility and the thoroughness of its work. Any general thoughts about that, please, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, with auditing, it's a question of kind of where you start, really. So I think some of it is not the fault of auditors. I think that the accounting rules make it quite difficult for them to push back sometimes. So because of this move towards fair value, auditing has become a more kind of a proceduralized tick boxing sort of exercise. And so directors may present a bunch of accounts to auditors, and they've been working with the Big Four themselves so that they know that they've produced everything in accordance with the rules. And the auditors might say, well, we don't think that looks prudent. And the directors may turn around and say, well, you show me the rule that we broke, right? So I think that makes it more, I think that makes the task of auditing more tricky because the rules themselves permit so much discretion and subjectivity. So I think some of it is not the fault of the auditing firm, but that said, there is clearly a conflict of interests. issue when the same institutions that are giving the consulting advice also have audit-based activities and indeed derive much of their profit, partner profit from the consulting arm. So I think there's just a fundamental organizational problem there, and I would favour structural separation of those two activities so that we get a more effective auditing sector.
Adam, thank you very much. I understand your point of view completely. In a moment, my colleague Alexandra will pop in the details about an event we've got in, I think it's 2 or 3 weeks' time. The title of that event is The Case for Radical Reform of the Audit Profession. Don't get me wrong, we're not picking on the audit sector. It's just that we really do believe that it's a part of the ecosystem that needs to raise its game in terms of its overall positive impact on corporate governance. In fact, one of the ideas we're going to be talking about at the other event is the idea of independent audits, frankly, to try to break that conflict of interest between the fact that it's the corporate that's hiring the auditor. Effectively, it's like marking their own homework, but through a third party. And we think this kind of stuff's really quite important. Thank you, Adam, very much indeed. Let me open up to our audience. We've got a lovely crowd here with us today. So if you'd like to say something, please do. Just raise your hand or get my attention in some way. Introduce yourself briefly and then put your point to Professor Adam Lever. Mr. Nigel Cairns, you're first up, sir. Over to you. Thank you, Nigel.
Yeah, Nigel Cairns from Devon. I'd like to ask Adam, this is all complete to me, what you've been saying. I'm complete novice to these matters. And what puzzles me straight away is how firms value goodwill on their balance sheets. Is it purely subjective? Is there a standard that they all apply? It seems a bit sort of harem-scarum. Could you enlighten us slightly?
At one level, it's kind of really straightforward, but another level they've made it incredibly complicated. So you book goodwill on the basis on the difference between the book value of a firm that you're acquiring and the price you actually pay, the market price you actually pay. So it's just simply a kind of a subtraction. However, you used to, up until about 2003, 2004, you used to amortize that. So you used to write it off on an annual basis. That was scrapped as this fair value kind of advancement took hold. And now goodwill is subjected to an annual impairment test. And that is quite convoluted because I don't know if I really want to bore you with the technicalities, but the idea is you might buy a firm not just for the future cash flows of the firm itself, but for the synergies it might create. And so the impairment test is done at a kind of an imagined level of a thing called a cash generating unit. And this allows lots and lots of space, I would say, for incumbent to exercise discretion about whether to impair or not. So that's
Sorry, do you think this is a reliable system for people to? Because I think one of the statistics was that 20% almost of the companies could have their entire shareholder value, wiped out if that goodwill was taken out of the balance sheet. That seems extraordinary.
Yes. So this is, obviously one of the consequences of not amortizing your goodwill is firms are becoming increasingly intangible. And actually, I think what this does is it kicks in more volatility into the balance sheet. So you see these very large impairments, which can reduce shareholder equity from kind of a relatively healthy state to kind of negative equity in some, more negative net assets in some kind of circumstances. So yeah, it is. I think it's a danger, and I think amortization should be reintroduced. I think many of the characteristics of the goodwill asset would, fit the test for amortization anyway.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
That was interesting, and that particular exchange reminded me of when I think it was Gerald Ratner. Do you remember when Gerald Ratner told everybody very publicly, in a rather crazy way, that his products were rubbish? Ratner Jewelry he basically said, our products are cheap and nasty and rubbish. And surprise, surprise, the share price the following day went through the floor. It just goes to show the sensitivity of these sorts of things. I guess he destroyed the goodwill and the brand value quite literally overnight. Thanks, Adam and Nigel. That was interesting. We're going to go all the way to Washington, DC to hear from my good friend, Alan Mendelowitz. Please share your thought. Lovely to see you, Alan.
And Andy, thank you. Adam, I think this is an absolutely wonderful paper. And I think the implications of it are critical because basically, if you're concerned about providing to the investment community information about potential investments, you basically should provide information that gives the investor understanding of what the going concern value is. And there is a major wedge between the accounting portrayal and the going concern value. I mean, and what you've highlighted with your statistics is a wonderful example of how going concern value is undermined and made possible by accounting standards. And I think an interesting companion piece to this would be a paper where you look at metrics that would do a much better job of providing going concern value. And thank you again for really an outstanding presentation.
Alan, that was a lovely, lovely compliment to pay to Adam. Adam, I'd like you to hear a little bit more about Alan and his background, because Alan, if you don't mind, just spend a moment or two telling everybody a little bit about your background and the sorts of things you've done in the White House, etc. Because I'm quite touched by the warmth of your compliment to Adam just now. Alan, tell everybody a bit about you and your background, please.
I'm an economist by training. I was an academic. I was an economic policy fellow at the Brookings Institution, spent a number of decades in government, wrapping up my career as the chairman of a federal financial regulatory agency, Federal Home Loan Bank System. After completing that, I really set out during legislation for that became the Dodd-Frank Act to propose a component that would in fact transform the way the regulatory community collects data and information about the regulated financial industries or regulated financial firms. Succeeded in getting that proposal into Title I of Dodd-Frank. And I'm currently, I've created and headed up a not-for-profit, which has created an algorithmic financial contract or instrument standard, which enables the collection and analysis of granular transaction and position data. So it provides the computational infrastructure to move regulatory data collection and oversight to a whole new future, where the information they collect is so much more valuable and provides so much more insight into the condition of the regulated institutions.
Thanks, Alan. And I'm very pleased and proud to say that the TTF has been very engaged with Alan and his colleagues at the Actus Financial Research Foundation. What they have is absolutely, I'm going to use a very American term, and absolutely awesome. It has the potential to frankly revolutionize the way that data is managed in this kind of regulatory space. It really does. And just to evidence that, we've had some very big and important meetings with people at the Bank of England and at the FCA, and it's kind of led to this major international project we have on the go called the bear with me, called the Global Financial Services Data Standards Meta Study Strategy Group. There we go. We're getting people around the world together talking about these kind of things. Lovely to have you with us, Alan. Thank you very much. Let's open it up. Does anybody else have a comment or a question they'd like to put to Adam before we move on to the next point? Mr. Ed Tuhig, all the way in Canada, please. Nova Scotia, Canada, if I remember rightly, sir. Please introduce yourself, Ed. Ed, thank you.
Yes, I'm a retired chartered accountant, and I lost quite a bit of faith in my profession some decades ago, and I attribute it to the disease of the economists. that brought us into financialization and into larger corporations. And when the accounting firms became larger and larger, and I think that they lost the training of their members and lost the training of their morals and their that kind of thing. I think they caught the same disease that brought us to financialization, and that is a disease of greed. And I think that's what motivates them, just as it motivates most of the financial world.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you very much. Really interesting exchange of thoughts and ideas. Does anybody else have a point they'd like to put to Adam before we move on? Kim Schweitzer, lovely to have you with us. Kim, please tell everybody a little bit about yourself and then make your point. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. I'm Kim Schweitzer, founder of Time for Change London and ambassador and volunteer for Transparency Task Force. And I just wanted to ask, and perhaps others can jump in, maybe even Alan, about the differences in the accounting profession in the US versus the UK. Because when I was a director at PwC in the US, which was years ago, we were not allowed to consult to our audit clients. And there were a lot of regulations. In fact, I had to get rid of a lot of very good Vanguard holdings when I became a director, because we were not allowed to hold with any of the investment companies that we were auditing. Now, is there a big difference here in the UK? No.
No. I mean, it was introduced relatively recently, but that is now the case, that you can't provide both services to the same firm at the same time.
Thank you, Kim.
Thanks.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Adam. I think it's appropriate now that we show our appreciation to Adam for preparing and presenting what's clearly gone down as a very good presentation indeed. Adam, thank you very, very much indeed. Great to have you with us. And remember, family comes first. So it's 7 o'clock. I expect to see you disappear straight away. So thank you very much indeed. Okay. Before we go to our next speaker, Professor Gerhard Schnyder, I'm going to share some thoughts on a couple of matters. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the size of the problem in terms of corporate governance. So let me share with you a bit of information about Violation Tracker. Violation Tracker is a US-based database. Its purpose is to capture information about which corporations are the biggest regulatory violators and lawbreakers throughout the United States. Essentially, what it's got inside it is 490,000 civil and criminal cases from more than 300 agencies, with penalties of 669 billion in total. It's a wonderful database. I'll pop a link to into the chat in case you want to have a play later on. The particular reason I love this database is because it so convincingly shows how problematic the financial services sector is. There you go. Here's a list of the worst offending industries. And at the very top of that list is the financial services sector. Not only is it number one, look at the amount, 332 billion. And if you remember the figure I mentioned just now, 667 billion in total. So what that means is that roughly half of all the infringements against US authorities is attributable directly to the financial services industry. That's quite an achievement, inverted commas, if you get the sarcasm in my voice. Or putting it another way, if you add up all of the other industries together, every single one of them, from number 2, which is pharmaceuticals, all the way down to number 51, which is miscellaneous, they all added up together equate to the sum total of the financial services sector. And that's pretty damning indeed. The main reason, however, for showing you this is because I want to click here on largest penalties. And what we've got here are these massive infringements. So BP, a British company, I'm very sad to say, tops this US database. Total infringements of 20.8 billion, etc., etc. And it really is a very, very long and frankly very sad list. I guess there's a strong argument to suggest that every single one of these infringements against these companies is in some way attributable to some kind of corporate governance failure. Unless you're really cynical and you say to yourself, actually, these aren't corporate governance failures. These are calculated commercial risks. These companies know it actually pays them to break the rules in expectation that from time to time they'll get caught, they'll get prosecuted, but hey ho, in the overall scheme of things, it still makes commercial, short-termist sense. Depending on where you are on this spectrum of cynicism, that might be your view. Either way, I think this is frankly not good enough, and all professionally minded people who are in some way connected with business ought to be doing all we can collectively to try to make a positive difference. So I'll pop a link to that in the chat. Let's now please go to Professor Gerhard Schnyder, who'll introduce himself and share with you his thoughts around this theme, the case for radical corporate governance reform. Gerhard, also very, very pleased to have you with us, sir. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andy. Thanks so much for having me. And obviously I've got big shoes to fill now after Adam gave this excellent speech, which I also enjoyed very much. So actually my talk is going to dovetail nicely with Adam's. And I thought I'm just back, as it were, from 4 days of conference by Society for the Advancement of Socioeconomics. And so it's a 4-day conference where we discuss a lot about corporate governance. My network has a lot of corporate governance scholars presenting there. So I thought I might give you sort of like the latest cutting edge research. I mean, I know Adam has done a bit of that as well, and I'm going to follow up on that and then reflect a little bit on what lessons we may draw from this type of research for corporate governance reform. Because to me, the big puzzle in a sense is, or it's not so much a puzzle, but it's astonishing that we've been trying to govern corporations for ages now. And corporate governance has been on the agenda for reform since 1992 at the latest. And yet we don't seem to get a grip on the problems. It seems like an arms race between the villains and the regulators, and it seems like the villains are winning it. So I am sort of a bit puzzled by, what's wrong with the type of reforms. And I sort of deliberately, in a slightly provocative fashion, chose the subtitle, "The Wrong Kind of Transparency?" ? Are we barking up the wrong tree? So very briefly, I actually going to talk a lot about Adam's research in a sense. Financialization is obviously his domain as well, and how it links, in my view, to transparency. So it's great that Adam has already set the groundwork for that part of my talk. And then I want to talk about what we know about how law can influence corporate governance, what the role of legal reforms is, and what the limits of legal reforms is, and then briefly reflect on the implications. So financialization, is precisely what Adam was talking about. It's a big topic in corporate governance. As I said, in the 4 days conference, there were a great deal of papers on this issue of financialization, not just of the financial sector, but of non-financial corporations. What is meant by that really is essentially, there's many different ways in which people define it, but two things sort of seem to be key. One way in which the economy has become more financialized is that a larger part of profits come from financial market activities as opposed to productive activities. So interest income is in some cases more important for even non-financial corporations than their actual income from the productive activity. I mean, at least that's sort of, in a nutshell, in a slightly exaggerated manner, Greta Krippner's argument from 2005, I think, was the original paper. She's not the only one who points it out. And indeed, I should have had at least some work by Adam himself, and also Julie Froud and people in that group who have done some research on that, a lot of research on that in the UK. The other aspect of this financialization is the increasing payout ratios, which Adam also talked about. And their seminal paper was by Bill Lazonik and Mario Sullivan that sort of describes the change of strategies in non-financial corporations from actually financial as well, retain and reinvest to downsize and distribute, right? So that the focus has shifted from retaining your profits and reinvesting them into your productive activity to downsizing the workforce and distributing the money to shareholders. So these are two aspects of this. And what's come out of the recent research, in a sense, is that actually turns out in the post-global financial crisis situation with low interest rates, the former, the increasing interest income, increasing importance of interest income for corporations is sort of not as clear anymore, but the latter clearly persists. So the payout ratios are much higher than they used to be, and in many cases they're still increasing. And that is exactly a sign of a move towards a rentier capitalism, the takers rather than the makers. We don't reinvest enough in corporations. We take the money out and it goes somewhere, often in tax havens and so forth. So there is this interesting trend. So how does that relate to transparency? Well, I mean, the approach in corporate governance reforms has often been a very simplistic one to transparency, and sort of this notion of sunlight is the best disinfectant. But it turns out transparency can also be part of the problem, perhaps. Indeed, my PhD dissertation back in the early 2000s was on changes in corporate governance in Switzerland. And there was a huge debate in the 1980s when we moved towards more transparency in accounting, and people warned about the effect this might have on claims on the company's profits. And indeed, the transparency oftentimes goes together with more aggressive accounting standards, more aggressive accounting methods, and the sort of just value accounting or mark-to-market accounting is a part of that, right? And it's a way in which transparency leads to more greed, in a sense, I would argue, because, for instance, again, many continental European corporations had large amounts of hidden reserves. That was often considered a problem because it meant that managers could use the money however they wanted without anybody knowing about it. But it also provided companies with quite a lot of slack in times of crises, in times of when decisions had to be made about investments or retaining workforce. That slack has been squeezed with this increased transparency, in a sense. So I would sort of argue that transparency, if it's not done carefully, can be part of the problem in this move towards rentier capitalism, or I think in the trailer you showed, Andy, they talked about capitalism of greed or greed economy or something like that. This is, I think, the same phenomenon. The second set of research, and here apologies, I'm doing a bit of self-promotion as well, is about more broadly the role of legal reforms to help us solve these corporate governance issues. It's quite astonishing how much money is being spent on legal reforms in the area of corporate governance. If you think of the World Bank doing business reports, IMF, OECD, EBRD, they have large units of legal reform, and a lot of lawyers earn a lot of money advising governments and so forth on how to reform the corporate governance system. And that's often based also on a simplistic assumption, where the assumption is that there's a straightforward link between legal reform behaviors and economic outcomes. And essentially, it's a sort of 19th century view of rule and punish, or command and control, in a sense, whereby you introduce a new rule, you enforce it, and you hope that people's behaviors change. But the research I've been doing with colleagues, Matthias Siems and Ruth Aguilera in particular, but also others, suggests that the relationship between laws and outcomes and behaviors is much more complex than the standard financial economics approach to law and corporate governance, law and finance suggests. And in particular, a recent paper that we've published in the British Journal of Management is on legal perception. It actually shows that the actual content of laws doesn't matter as much as its perception by shareholders. Whatever the actual effect of the law on corporate governance is not the crucial issue. The crucial issue is what people perceive to be good law and bad law. So where you have a country where the law is actually not so good, but it has a reputation for good law, the impact of law on firm value in an IPO is more positive than in a country that is perceived to have bad law, but in actual fact, the law is substantively very good. So that's sort of a finding. We sort of use this to then draw onto, to develop sort of a theory of how law matters in corporate governance that is more subtle, that sort of takes into account these misperceptions of law and the fact that companies can actually play with that, with the reputational effect. You don't have to follow law very closely to have a good reputation and hence increase your stock market value. So I'm not sure if that was very clear. It's a slightly complicated argument, which I don't want to go into too much detail, but we've got 2 blogs which I'm happy to post also in the chat afterwards. One on the Columbia Law School blog, which sort of summarizes the argument probably better than I've just done. So moving on, the implications for corporate governance reform that I see coming out of these 2 streams of research on corporate governance is, in a sense, that we really need to ask the question, what sort of transparency do we want? I think transparency is a double-edged sword, and we need to think about what it is that should be disclosed and how it should be disclosed. And the second one is that legal reforms on their own clearly won't do the trick. We've been trying to reform corporate governance for years. You could argue that the direction of these reforms was mainly to help shareholders take out more money from corporations, and that might be part of the problem. But basically, I sort of think both legal reforms and transparency have unexpected side effects, which haven't been taken into account enough in the corporate governance practice, in a sense. So what can be done? The title of this symposium is The Case for Radical Corporate Governance Reform. And there's certainly people who do make this case. Bill Lazonic, who spoke on Sunday at this conference, he has a very clear stance. He said share buybacks need to be banned. They're the key problem in the US as well, increasingly as well in the UK. They simply need to be outlawed, and that would be one first step to go. I'm not entirely sure about this, but what I would say is fundamentally, and this, I'm pleased somebody mentioned this before, to me, one of the key problems here is fundamentally that we have a problem with morals and with ethics, and this can't be solved by law. That's also something that we do in our research on the law. Sometimes law can crowd out good behaviors, because once it becomes a question of control and punish, it shifts people's mindsets into how can I get away with, Andy, you mentioned it when you showed, the violation tracker. You mentioned it. It becomes a game of, it's just a cost that we can calculate. It's a risk we can optimize. And it's sort of, this behavioral research also on this effect of crowding out pro-social behaviors by shifting the focus on this, on the cost of misbehavior. So I've argued this before, and I don't really have a solution, of course, but I do think business scholars, educators have a role to play in improving what we teach on MBAs, what we teach directors, future directors, in terms of, the understanding of the corporate governance impact on societies and on the economy. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Gerhard, that was absolutely excellent, first class. Thank you very, very much indeed. I could spend the rest of the session asking you questions based upon what you've just spoken about, but I won't hog things, I promise. What I will do though is make reference to something in particular. The comment you just made here about the idea that we need ethics in the system to make people do the right thing, as opposed to just being made to do the right thing. I really get that. I really do get that. But at the same time, I have this kind of tension between that thought and another one, and this other thought is the idea that in a kind of a principles-based way of regulating doesn't work when you're dealing with people who haven't got any principles. Yeah, it's an old saying, principle-based regulation doesn't work if you haven't got any principles. I think there's a real tension here between trying to construct a framework that makes good things happen or tries to stop bad things happening, and relying on good old-fashioned ethics and values and purposefulness. In your own mind, Gerhard, how do you kind of reconcile the tension between those two? Any thoughts about that? Because I often swing from one end of that spectrum to the other. I really do.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. It's an excellent thought. I mean, I think one thing that, you know, I mean, when I'm saying things like I just did, you know, it's about morals, it's about ethics, it's about education. I mean, that comes across sometimes as arrogant, sometimes as naive, right? But what sort of does give me hope is that it is possible to construct social situations in which people behave in ways that are, you know, pro-social in a sense, right? In the sense that fundamentally, I don't think people without principles are lost causes, right? It's oftentimes the context that makes them behave in the way that they do. And for instance, there's quite a lot of literature, and this is sort of outside of corporate governance, but maybe could be drawn on more to understand corporate governance as well in sort of general risk regulation and industrial accident regulation. For instance, two things that have been observed is, you know, when regulators do not punish immediately any wrongdoings, but you know, there's a system of dialogue where you have warnings for wrongdoings, where you establish a relationship with the regulator. Actually, you do observe that over time, companies behave more responsibly. That's the case in that there's a study, for instance, on I think it's nuclear power plants in Norway, for instance, where they shifted the system from punishing every little close call in terms of, you know, accident. And so there's, for instance, one concept called the regulatory pyramid, whereby you escalate the punishment, right? But you start with a dialogue. And I mean, I don't know if that answers your question, but to me, it sort of shows that, you know, with a relationship between the actors, you can achieve quite a lot in terms of overcoming, you know, the principle-less self-seeking behaviors in a sense. I don't think it's innate, you know, I think it's socially enabled, right? And hence what we need to change is sort of the framework in which people interact in a sense.
Thank you, Gerhard. I think we're being treated to some really wonderful thought leadership tonight. Gerhard, I noticed that Shan put a note in the chat. It says, this is Dr. Shan Turnbull. It says, Gerhard, do you recall the exchange that Bill Lazanik and myself had during his presentation last Sunday? I've got no idea what that means, but it's what Shan's referring to. Does that ring a bell at all?
It does, yeah. But I have to say, it was late in the evening, and it was a complex argument you were making, Shan. So, yeah. Okay,
we'll ask Shan to touch on that when he has his talk in a moment, because Shan's our next speaker. Really enjoyed that, Gerhard. Let's throw it open for any other comments or questions from anybody else on the session. Please just wave at me if you'd like to draw attention to you. It looks like we're going back to Washington, D.C. Mr. Alan Mendelowitz once again. How lovely. Thank you, Alan.
Thanks, Andy. Gerhard, really enjoyed that. That was really a wonderful presentation. The example of interface with the nuclear regulatory authorities in Norway reminded me, first of all, you know, how I approach problems as a manager. I would celebrate staff who brought me problems. And the reason was very simple. If I berated them for a failure, the only thing I could be sure of is that the next time there was a problem, I wouldn't hear about it. The problem would fester until it became big enough to sink the ship, in effect. So that when you're talking about regulation for safety, like a nuclear power plant or an airplane, for example, civil airplane, this notion of dialogue is important so that you take fear away from the operators or the managers, and you in effect celebrate them for bringing a problem that you solve together. So that's only one category, though, of corporate misconduct. The other one is where a corporation has a specific regulatory requirement it has to meet. And rather than facing a problem that it wants to keep away from the regulator, like a safety risk at a nuclear reactor, they set out to deliberately subvert the regulation. And that's the case, for example, of Volkswagen and several other major German companies, where Volkswagen, instead of meeting the emission standards in the United States for diesel-powered motor vehicles, they set out to literally subvert the regulation by putting in a cheat into the software, so that the software detected when the vehicles were being tested by the Environmental Protection Agency and gave the result that was required by the regulation. But when the vehicle was on the road and being driven, it reverted to a different software instruction set, which in fact spewed tremendous pollutions into the air. And so I think that your suggestion works with the safety risk at a nuclear power plant, but there are still other challenges. I'd like your ideas about how you go about dealing with those.
Okay, let's go to Gerhard, in case you'd like to respond to the point that's just been made by Alan.
Yes, that's obviously an excellent point. I mean, it's one thing to prevent companies from, having accidents, which is something they don't necessarily want to have, whereas undermining regulation, undercutting standards is something they may want to do. And depending on the criminal energy that goes into that, it becomes obviously much more difficult to catch that. And that's another thing, I think. I mean, again, you'll probably be disappointed with my answer, but it's something that we do need to approach from a new perspective. And in a sense, Andy's the trailer he showed about the corporation, this notion of the corporation as a psychopath, it does hint at something that regulators maybe have underestimated in some respects. I mean, I've been saying that, we shouldn't approach it as control and punish and so forth, but regulation is still sort of based on the idea that people have some sort of limit to how much how much energy they invest in breaking the laws, and to some extent, indeed, I think that came out in the initial discussions as well about auditing and so forth. I mean, the auditing system is sort of based on the assumption audit is fundamentally, I mean, Andy said it, like, it depends on how cynical you are, and in some respects, we do need to think about regulation that sort of, I mean, this is an old argument in legal theory by Hart about, the law, should the law be geared towards the bad man, right, or the bad woman, or should it be geared towards the average citizen who tries to abide by the law? And I think there is sort of, not willingly, but the law oftentimes does assume a certain level of decency in human beings, and I think that's one thing that is not always given. And the Volkswagen case is really striking, right? It's a very illustrious company. I mean, it's got a dark history as well, of course, but still, you wouldn't expect that sort of behavior. But what I think sort of needs to happen again, there's suggestions of, management training should have some sort of personality checks as well. I mean, maybe what I'm trying to say is, with cynical enough people and enough criminal energy, I think any regulation is bound to fail. It just seems impossible to address that level of criminal energy, and therefore, again, maybe we need to think outside the box and think about, is there something that can be done to stop people who are behaving in the extremely cynical and almost psychopathic ways from getting to the top? There's some discussions actually in universities about that, because I'm sorry, I'm going to finish in a minute, but
Carry on.
There is some discussions about vice chancellors in UK universities. And I maybe shouldn't be saying that, as they employ me, but but there is, like, vice chancellors are amongst the most highly paid people in the UK now, and their salaries have increased tremendously over the past 20 years. And there's a suggestion, and there are terrible stories about how vice chancellors make people's lives hell. I mean, UK universities essentially are for-profit corporations these days, and there are genuine, serious people who suggest there needs to be some sort of personality check somewhere, so that it's not the most selfish, the most ruthless people who get to the top, but it's pro-social people. And I think fundamentally the same goes for corporations as well. At one stage, it's a selection problem. It's a self-selection bias that gets the worst people to positions where they have a lot of power. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but it's sort of my spontaneous thoughts on this very good point. Thanks, Alan.
I have to follow on from that. I have to, because we ran an event in Boston about 2 years ago, and one of the attendees educated me on something called moral quotient. And what this gentleman was basically saying, he ran a big recruitment company. Particularly, he was placing leaders in financial services firms. And to cut a long story short, some of the more progressive, advanced, enlightened financial services firms in Boston's that kind of place, basically, when they recruit new leaders, they recruit mindful of this thing called moral quotient. So this thing here, moral intelligence or moral quotient, it's basically the idea that if you're going to hire a new chief executive, let's say a bank or a financial institution, for goodness sake, don't hire somebody who has a low moral quotient, because the risk of that person crashing the organization onto the shore, onto the rocks, is very, very high. So you'd rather have somebody who was ethical and technically less competent than somebody who was unethical and highly competent. And this really does speak to your point very well, I thought, Gerhard. That was extremely interesting, what you were saying. So I'll put a link to that Wikipedia chat. I feel a bit daft putting Wikipedia links into a chat, having heard from such leading academics today, but you'll forgive me, I'm sure. Does anybody else have a comment that they'd like to put to Gerhard, or a question? It looks like we're all good. Gerhard, great job. Really enjoyed that. I'm learning a lot this evening. I think we've had two absolutely outstanding speakers. Let's please show our appreciation to Professor Gerhard Schnyder. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much.
First class, absolutely first class. And of course, Gerhard, thank you for the links you put into the chat as well. Super stuff. Our next speaker, I can't introduce Dr. Shan Turnbull without referring to when I first had the pleasure of hearing him talk, for a couple of reasons. One of them being, it was on the other side of the world. So I think it was October last year, sorry, not October last year, October the year before, we were running an event in Sydney, Australia. Dr. Shan Turnbull, who's about to speak for you, spoke at this event and talked about polycentric governance, if I remember rightly, and it absolutely blew me away. I really loved it, and I felt almost stunned for a few days after, thinking through the significance of the message that Dr. Shan Turnbull was going to deliver. So can I please invite everybody to welcome in just a moment Dr. Shan Turnbull. But before we do that, I'm just going to refer to this part of our website. During 2019, I ran events in Dublin, Amsterdam, Zurich, Brussels, Hong Kong, Singapore, Sydney, Melbourne, Washington, DC, and New York. And I also spoke in India. And the net result of all that is that we were able to take the Transparency Task Force from being a very UK-centric organisation to what we have now. I think we've got about 1,000 members outside the UK, including, of course, Dr. Shan Turnbull, who lives in Australia. So we have Transparency Task Force USA and Asia and Europe and Australia and Canada and also South Africa. And we are working so hard to build an impactful network right around the world. And Dr. Shan Turnbull is one of our ambassadors in Australia. Shan, please introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your background. Also tell us what time it is in Australia right now, because once again, you've done the wonderful thing of going beyond the call of duty and getting up rather early for us, Shan. Over to you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. So this is based on when I did the presentation of Andy a couple of years ago. I then got invited to do a keynote global webinar, which the details are there, which cover much more than I'm going to say in 10 minutes. I'm concerned about toxic governance arising from these 3 points. And I'm going to suggest that we introduce tax incentives to reform firms to adopt this polycentric form that Andy mentioned. And we get toxic governance because English firms committed to a unitary board do not introduce a separation of powers. And it provides directors with absolute power to identify and manage their own conflicts of interest to corrupt absolutely themselves, the organisation, its auditors, regulators and societies. The second toxic problem arises from simple command and control hierarchies, as they can unfairly exploit, demean and abuse subordinates while entrenching groupthink, frustrate individual well-being and contrariness. Autonomous behaviour introduces a yin-yang tensegrity that provides internal checks and balances required for self-management, self-governance, and the reliable, comprehensive management of complexity. Self-management, self-governance is not taught at any university that I'm aware of. The third toxic problem is that property rights and excessive investors' time horizon overpay investors in a way not reported by accountants and so not known by economists to create inequality, inefficiency, and so bigger taxes in government that undermines democracy. This is one of the biggest problems that Piketty did not address. And economists don't even have a word for profits in excessive incentive. I call it surplus profits. So the solution I'm suggesting for these problems, removing toxic governance, is with tax incentives for shareholders to amend their constitutions to eliminate all toxic features by introducing this ecological governance found in our brains that has distributed decision making bottom up and top down. And our brains have no chief executive neuron, and that's just incomprehensible to academics and the public and governance scholars, that you could have a successful business without a chief or a leader. Everybody teaches leadership. This tax incentive would give institutions with a fiduciary duty to maximize short-term profits that be legally required to vote for such changes that provided bigger, quicker profits to shareholders with less risk, on condition that they gave away their equity at, say, 5% a year to stakeholders type of shares. So there's three solutions I'm suggesting here. That shareholders, you change the corporate constitution so shareholders separate the powers of directors into two. And I'd like anybody to suggest that they know of any ethical reason why directors should have both the power to govern and the power to manage. So you have one board to manage and a governance board to govern. It really just takes over the role of the audit, remuneration, nomination committees and governance duties. The other changes in the corporate constitution is that each stakeholder constituency obtains voice, influence, resources to advise the shareholders directly and their governors, independently of management and the management board, metrics of their individual well-being from corporate operations. The third change in the corporate constitution is to create this stakeholder class of shares, and each year a fixed amount of equity, of investors' equity, is transferred to those shares, which are in turn endowed to stakeholders who are voting citizens, not other corporations. This creates ecological, sustainable, democratic capitalism. It's a way of privatizing the tax and welfare system because corporations are distributing wealth to stakeholders on a democratic basis. The tax incentives are self-funding because their costs are recovered from citizens paying tax at high rates and reducing government welfare costs and the costs of corporate regulators. The endowment corporations become what Elinor Ostrom calls the common good, providing benefits to all stakeholders, locally and globally. Capitalism becomes sustainable, maintaining shareholder primacy for stakeholder owners. This was wanted by the largest asset manager in the world, Larry Fink. He wanted a new model of corporate governance to provide benefits for all stakeholders, which is provided by ecological governance. The answer was provided 16 years earlier when the New Economics Foundation in London invited me to write a new way to govern organizations and society after Enron. They're looking for a way to avoid Thatcher privatization without having government ownership. And this is really what I'm going to talk to today. It's an old idea, but there's no academic literature on exchanging ownership for tax advantages. And this is for the academics, showing the literature, and the most prestigious is the History of Management Thought, where the seminal papers of the leading academics have been published. This is a copy of the last appendix of my 1975 book, which shows 3 levels of tax incentives required to provide investors with bigger profits quicker with less risks. It was taken up by the United Nations in Geneva, where it shows the investor fading out with a profit while the stakeholders take over. This is a way of transferring surplus profit to stakeholders, because surplus profits aren't reported by accountants. You can't tax them. The only way to do it is ownership sharing. And the idea of limited life investment boggles most people's minds, but they were the only way. After America fought for the War of Independence, all corporations had limited life because they didn't want to be colonized by the English again. I've walked the talk of limited life investments. I've formed 2 public companies where the risk money was raised on a 15-year property rights, also in the film business. Now, another problem we have of hierarchies that simplify complexity incompletely. And this shows you how directors, the 2 assumptions of this table is that as the information passes up from the workers to the board or the minister, half the information is lost, which would be much more in practice at each level. And there's 15% errors creeping in at each level. So it ends up the board of directors only get the missing and wrong information is 99%. Wow. And there's a law of communication say that you can get information as accurately as you like, provided you have a requisite variety of independent cross-checking network channels, which is provided by the policy of ecological governance. Hierarchies often create these sort of disasters of the Challenger launch. This is a neurologist, English neurologist called Ross Ashby, who introduced the law of requisite variety for reliably controlling variables. The law applies to communications as well as to control, and you just got to have cross-checking control on everything you do. Now, the guy that started Visa International, which has polycentric governments, called D. Hock, and he said industrial age hierarchies command and control pyramids of power, whether political, social, educational, commercial, were aberrations of the industrial age, antithetical to the human spirit, destructive of the biosphere, and structurally contrary to the whole history and methods of biological evolution. They are not only archaic and increasingly irrelevant, they are a public menace. So what I want to do is model corporations on the self-government architecture that you find in nature. And the first thing you've got to do of toxic governance is to separate the power to manage from the power to govern. Here you have the shareholders meeting here, and they're electing the management board on 1 vote per share. But the board of guardians, or the governance board, is elected an old-fashioned idea called 1 vote per investor. That's called democracy. And it's that board that controls the auditor, not the people. The management board is set and mark its own exam papers, as Andy pointed out. So it's a top-down division of power. And we complement it with a bottom-up contestability. So power is contested by the stakeholder assemblies, the supplier forums, the customer council, and the community committees. And they form a stakeholder congress, and they advise the shareholders directly, independently of management, of their well-being. And so you don't need to have, management doesn't have to create metrics of responsibility. The people that are affected by the firm do. Put them both together and you get this polycentric governance where you have different centers of power. This is for private companies or privately traded companies or publicly ones. Elinor Ostrom received the Nobel Prize for identifying how you could have self-governance and self-management without the state and without hierarchies. No markets and no hierarchies. And Australian Aborigines have done this for $65,000 years. It's based on bottom-up governance, not taught at universities, not known. When I suggested to the Dean of Harvard, said there's no market for it. Now, these are business that you may all know. John Lewis Partnership in England is polycentric governance. It's controlled by its stakeholders. It's bottom-up. The Mondragon Cooperatives are the same. Visa International, also the Japanese Keiretsu, and each of these organizations have existed for half a century in a competitive environment. Now, the model for those, Ralph Nader introduced citizen utility boards, and they were done on a voluntary basis by the stakeholders contributing money to fund the watchdog boards. So I've used watchdog boards in the two public companies I mentioned earlier. So I've walked the talk and introduced watchdog boards to watch me as the promoter. I've accidentally formed polycentric governance for sporting bodies and the civic societies. Ski clubs in Australia, they cooperate with each other, but they compete against each other on the field to create state divisions. And those state divisions in Australia, the state teams compete against each other, but they cooperate to form a national body, which I was a voluntary chief executive of, and I incorporated it into a company. And it then competed and cooperated with national organizations in other countries to form the international controlling body, which in turn competed against other sports to form the Olympic Committee. So that's create without state and without hierarchy, and it's polycentric governance. The same with the Institute of Company Directors. When I joined the progenitor organization in 1976, I found the chairman was using it for private purposes. He resigned to do family business, and I changed the corporate constitution so the national board was a federation of self-managing state chapters. So again, there was polycentric governance providing checks and balances so power couldn't be concentrated to corrupt absolutely. Neurologists Kelso and Elgerstrom wrote The Complementary Nature. DNA hardwires into all of us and animals this paradoxical yin-yang behavior. We can be cooperative and we can be competitive. We can be altruistic and we can be selfish. And this ability to be contrary is being lost, is subdued and punished in hierarchies. Our brains possess distributed decision making. Different parts of our brain make different decisions for different occasions. Indigenous societies do the same thing, and it's a way of simplifying complexity. And we have both active and reactive neurons. In other words, nature builds in checks and balances to get accountability. And I won't go through each of these. This is how toxic hierarchies create all these problems down the left-hand column. By mimicking the laws of nature, you can eliminate the toxic governance. I just flick through them and to come to the end so I can take questions at the end. Thank you.
Wonderful, Shan. Absolutely wonderful. Allow me to ask you this question. How would you summarize overall what you think in just a few sentences, just to give everybody a kind of consolidated understanding of where you're coming from? Could I ask you to do that for me, please, Shan? Thank you.
Well, it is in the first slide. We have too much. Directors have unnecessary powers. They have too much power, and power corrupts. And they don't know what's happening down in the boiler room. They don't have feedback from the stakeholders. There's no formal way of them finding out what's really happening in large organizations. It's ridiculous. It's irresponsible. And all the problems of auditing is because, as you say, directors are setting and marking their own exam papers. Ethics, specialist ethics don't notice that. It's unethical. It comes back to have unethical structures. I call them toxic, but replace the word ethics for toxic. I mean, and the purpose of an annual general meeting is to hold directors to account. Now, is there anybody here that thinks that that the directors should control the process of being accountable? When I was in Iceland, I met the chair of their biggest corporation, and I asked her, "Who chairs their annual meeting?" She said, "I never do. That'll be unethical." It's a shareholder who is not a director chairs the meeting. This would be unheard of in England. But England, England has poisoned the ethics of the world with the Cadbury report. Now, Cadbury is a very ethical and proper person, and it illustrates how good people can do bad things. And here, and the World Bank and the OECD have all adopted different forms of the governance rules, and the governance rules themselves are unethical. It is quite silent on who controls AGMs, and it promotes, and governments of the Cadbury report got it back to front. Directors should not form audit committees. It should be the shareholders that form the audit committees, and that's what I'm proposing. It's very simple: separation of powers. We do it politically. We don't do it for corporations, and this is how corporations undermine democracy. It's shocking, and we don't want to put up with it anymore.
Thank you,
so
Shan.
I went over my 2 sentences. I failed my test.
But Shan, you're always so interesting. You always leave me with so much new stuff to think about. I really enjoy your talks, and I once again want to thank you for making such an enormous effort to set the alarm at, I don't know, would it have been 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning to speak to us today. So wonderful, Shan, absolutely first class, sir. Can we please throw it open for comments and questions? I'm going to invite Marcus Krebs to join the conversation. So Marcus, what are your reflections on what Shan's been talking about, and indeed anything else? And if you wouldn't mind, sir, please tell everybody a little bit about you so that they've got an understanding of where you're coming from as well, Marcus. Thank you.
Oh dear. Well, I guess by commenting, I sort of invited myself now into this conversation. Thanks, Andy, for doing this, and thanks for this session tonight. Some very good talks here. I'm not going to bore you too much because you can check me out on LinkedIn, but I'm a non-executive director at a couple of organizations. You can hear by now I'm German originally, but I've been in the UK long enough to show my battle scars, I guess. And I'm an advisor to the United Nations since 2013 in the systemic risk and regulatory system space, which covers everything from disaster recovery, global pandemic response, autonomous systems, cybersecurity, and more recently, a work stream I established there that is around artificial intelligence, new technology, robotics, and the ethics of all of that. My background is ultimately, I guess, more than 20 years risk management, almost 30 years banking and financial institutions. I've been involved in the cleanup work of some of the largest global rogue trading incidents at some very large financial institutions. So I've been deep in the dumps and seen what's happening. And I've also done some work for the World Bank in both Africa and Asia, improving local capital markets and also local utilities. So I've been around the houses, I guess. I'm an ambassador of the TTF, I think one of the early members, probably, Andy. I've been with you since, I guess, 2015 or so. I was the chief risk officer of the UK Municipal Bonds Agency, which is a bank for the UK government, a local one, not a central one. And I've also been involved in probably by now 3 different APPGs. One is the TTF's financial stability one. The other one is now called Taxpayer Fairness, and there's a couple of others. Where should we start? I guess I've seen a lot of bad things happen, and I've been drumming the drum of conduct risk and embedding good culture and doing the right thing, particularly in the UK, for a long time now. And since the FCA arrived in 2013, bearing in mind they've got the C for conduct risk in the name, and have never managed to actually define what they understand with that. I come up with 2, I guess, conduct risk paradigms. One for banks and financial services. I was in 2016 and was very well welcomed by the markets. And then on the back of that, the UN asked me to remove the F word for financials, and turn it into a universal conduct risk paradigm. A little bit earlier up in the chat, I put the link. It's on the UNC website. You can download it there. It's also on my LinkedIn profile. And I'd love more people and more organizations using it, because I think it's a good framework for conduct risk and doing the right thing. I agree with Sean. I think the UK.
Shan the man.
Shan, I agree with you. I think the UK is one of the countries and nations globally who, I don't want to say pretends, but who seems to be doing a lot in the corporate governance space, But when you sort of scratch below the surface, you find a lot improvement is needed. And the kind of tensegrity you're referring to, the yin and yang, and sort of both the integrity and the tension that balances each other out, I think it's something that needs to be worked on. And we need to move back to, and I agree with you, more empowering minority shareholders, more empowering employee assemblies, who are all stakeholders within the organization, but who often haven't got the voice and haven't got the ability to speak up. And often they're doing the stuff on the ground and picking up when things are going wrong first. But whistleblowers are typically not necessarily rewarded, neither from a reputational perspective nor from a financial perspective. So there's no encouragement to come forward and speak up and change the status quo. So I think where we currently are, an awful lot has to be done. And bringing in my AI hat now a little bit and the ethics around it, I think it's going to get worse before it's going to get better. And I'll leave it at there because I've said quite a lot now. But thanks.
Marcus, thank you very much indeed. Again, always very, very thought-provoking. The thought that it's going to get worse before it gets better is actually a little bit depressing, because I think it's quite bad at the moment. Wonderful. Would anybody else like to share their thoughts following on from Shan's session, please?
Andy, I'd like to ask you.
Yeah, go for it.
What I had in my last slide was, who's going to lobby for tax deductions to reform corporate charters? Now, corporate charters there's nobody teaching how to design corporate charters. Now, Katharina Pisto, at my prompting, started a course, but it's no longer going, of designing corporate charters. And there's no literature in the academics about exchanging equity for tax benefits. Now, I'm looking for a lobbyist. My last PowerPoint said, who can help? Who can talk to their political agitators to get tax tied to sharing equity to democratize the wealth of nations and save humanity from extinction by corporations poisoning the soils, atmosphere, and water? What can you do?
What can we do? What can I do?
Yes.
What can we do?
Yes, I'm putting the onus on you. That's the purpose I got up in the morning, Andy.
But believe me, Shan, I already feel like I've got the weight of the world on my shoulders. I really do. I really do.
Well, you've got to focus. You've got to focus on what solves many problems with one stroke, rather than spread yourself around enormously like you do. Get away from the films, get away from the responsibility, get away from the talk, get the action.
Get the action. Thanks for the caution, Shan. I'm gonna respond to your question by going back to, in some ways, the most important point you made tonight, and you've made many, I think. You know, when you said the lady at Harvard said there's no money in that, right?
No, it was the dean.
The dean.
There's
okay.
no market.
There's no
Dean
market.
MacArthur. Dean MacArthur, who employed Michael Jensen.
Okay, at Harvard, yeah. Okay, so that idea, the idea that you're very, very, and I mean this absolutely genuinely, you're very progressive, enlightened, thoughtful, planet-saving mindset, society-saving mindset, which I absolutely love. I really dig the way you think, Shan. I really, really do. It's brilliant, but there's no market for it, in the sense that the people who have all the power and the people who kind of monopolize the power in the system as it's currently structured don't want it, because it takes power away from them. And this is fundamentally the very problem that we keep seeing in so many different parts of the system. The good people don't have the power. The not so good people exploit the power that they've got. And in fact, it's quite beautifully summed up in a quote that we had the other day. One of our members, this quotation here from Brian Basham, he's one of our ambassadors, he's a Brit. He says, in a lightly regulated society, the least principled people rise to the top and eventually dominate. And the kind of message within that, in other words, the powerful people have the power and those that haven't got the power may have a better way of looking at the world, but because they don't have the power, they can't actually make change happen. This is the conundrum, and it inevitably takes my thinking to politics again.
Well, that's what I want you to get into, because my proposal is to give votes. Politicians that promote this plan of tax for equity,
Right.
it should get 90% of the vote.
Well, it would if we had what I call dynamic democracy. In other words, where we have democracy that's truly reflecting of the wishes of the people. That was the original kind of concept going back, ancient Greece and all that lot. What we have at the moment, I think, is and forgive me if this sounds a bit kind of conspiracy theorist, but we have a kind of politely corrupted version of democracy where the more you understand it, the more you realize that the people in power are actually representing the interest of a minority, whereas they're supposed to be representing the people of the majority. So I don't think we'll end up in utopia, Shan, until we have a properly functioning dynamic democracy. And my God, if I had my time all over again, I think I would have left school, joined a political party and tried to make a difference that way.
Andy, don't be so negative. The biggest asset manager in the world, Larry Fink, in 2018 said he wants to benefit all stakeholders, and the US Business Roundtable all had Larry Fink as a shareholder.
Yeah.
And so the Business Roundtable adopted his proposal of benefiting all stakeholders. What they haven't got is a mechanism for getting there, and the tax incentive will achieve that.
We'll do that.
So why you need to get on the bandwagon of the biggest asset. He manages what, $7 trillion. He's huge. He's almost. Think positively. You're saying, oh, it can't be done. There's too much power. But there's the most powerful man in the world, the biggest investor in the world, promoting these ideas. He doesn't know the method of doing it.
So we need to get into Larry Fink's ears somehow. Shan, leave that with me as a challenge to overcome. Between now and tomorrow morning, I'll sort the world out for you. Thank you.
I'll give you a little hint. His managing director of stewardship was my boss when I wrote that book called A New Way to Govern.
Right.
And we're both working for Hermes Focus Asset Management.
Thank you very much indeed, Shan. Thank you. We're going to get ourselves back on track time-wise. I'm going straight to Krzysztof Grabowski in just a moment. But before we do, can I please invite everybody to put their hands together to thank Shan for his, as ever, thought-provoking presentation. Thank you very much indeed, Shan.
Thank you,
Good stuff. Good stuff. Good stuff. Krzysztof, you've got 5 minutes allocated for you, Krzysztof. So over to you, please, sir. Thank you very much indeed. And of course, start off with a brief introduction. Tell everybody about who you are, where you are, what you do, Krzysztof. Mr. Krzysztof Grabowski, everybody. Thank you.
Good evening to everybody. You see, it's very difficult to say who am I, because I've been working for 30 years in different financial market institutions, starting from the brokerage house, then stock exchange, then supervisory body. And I used also to be the president of the Association of Polish Brokers and Advisors. Now I am retired and fighting with market manipulation. But I am really sorry that Professor Schnyder had to leave us because I do have one slide which perfectly fits to his presentation. And thank you, Professor Schnyder, for your lecture, for your presentation. The title, Corporate Harmony. This is a very nice title for me, because in Polish we have at least 3 different translations of corporate governance. The one that I like much more, the best, it's Ład Korporacyjny, and the backward translation into English gives the name Corporate Harmony. And I would like to explain why I do call that corporate harmony. And Professor Schnyder explained us that there's a very complex relationship between law and corporate governance. That my slide explains that perfectly. Let's see the system of law in a given jurisdiction. We have two main areas: client area and corporation area. And when you stretch a line horizontally, we have an upper area, hard law, and we have a system of law in a given jurisdiction. And on the left side, we have client area. On the right side, corporation area. On the upper side, we have legal regulations area, hard law, so-called hard law. And at the bottom area, self-regulation, soft law. This is a room for corporate governance. And we have a circle with regulations for a given field of activities. I have prepared that model a few years ago for financial market, but it can suit very well at any other sector of business. So on the left side, we have upper left side, we have financial markets law. On the bottom side, we have codes of best practices. On the right side, corporation area, we have company law and corporate governance principles. But those areas are moving between, they are mending between. So there are some rules, some regulations in financial market law that touch company law, and the opposite, company law touches financial market law. The same is with codes of best practices and corporate governance principles. But those movements goes also vertically, because some corporate governance principles go up to hard law, to company law. The same with the codes of best practices and financial markets law. But sometimes there's the other direction of law. So some hard law regulations go down to corporate governance principles. But if everything fits very well, we receive an inner circle, integration sphere, as I call it, and this is the the proper area when we have really good corporate governance. We can have here corporate harmony area. But what I am afraid now that when we look at the current movements, the more and more regulations go up from corporate governance principles to company law, to hard regulations. And the effect is that the more regulation we introduce, the more regulations we need, because the hard law regulation have to be very strict, very exact. Corporate governance principles are more flexible. They give us some directions how we should proceed, not punishment already, and but rather promoting and awarding. And what also Professor Schnyder has told, that the best way of putting regulations is not punishing directly, immediately, but rather to talk, to make a dialogue, to explain how the company should proceed, how the board should proceed, what they should do. So regulations, good regulations, should leave room for that dialogue. And this is the room for corporate governance, because in corporate governance, we can talk, we can discuss, we can persuade ourselves. So if we introduce too much regulations, we lose the idea of corporate governance. That there should be equilibrium. What can we now see? That almost everything goes up to hard law area. And that's why, in my opinion, corporate governance is not working properly now. Because we leave everything to the regulators. And regulators very often do not understand business very well. They do not understand people because they are bureaucrats. They do not work in business. They do not talk to shareholders. They do not talk to stakeholders. So we should rather than punishing, we should rather promoting and awarding good corporate governance. And what we now doing in Poland, because you see, there's now I became much more and more pessimistic about corporate governance, because on there's some kind of greenwashing. The corporations tell us, well, we have good corporate governance, we are well governed, but in practice it's not the way. So the other way, how could we promote good corporate governance? And one example of what we are doing in Poland, you see, for several years we have a contest for the best annual report for listed companies. This is not obligatory. The company who wants to be assessed, that they send us the annual report. And last year, we've introduced a separate part of that contest. It's a report on corporate governance. And you can earn, for the whole contest, you can earn 100 points. But 40 points for financial report, 30 points for managerial report, and up to 30 points for the quality of your corporate governance statement. And you see, after that, the company receives the exact explanations, how many points they earned, and why so many, and why so less. So that they have a chance to be promoted for good corporate governance, and that they have a chance to make the corporate governance better. And I believe that's the way of if we say if we discuss about corporate governance reform, we should do as much as possible to promote corporate governance and to avoid over-regulation.
Thank you, Krzysztof. Very, very clear message indeed. And I love the way your diagram all fits together. Krzysztof, thank you very, very much indeed. Can we please show our appreciation for Krzysztof Grabowski all the way in Poland? Thank you very much, Krzysztof. We're going to go straight to a quick comment from Philip Meadowcroft, and I'd then love for JB to put his question out there about the Quakers, because it's a really interesting point that JB made in the chat, and perhaps JB would like to come onto the screen and make his point in just a moment. Philip Meadowcroft, over to you. You've got 1 minute, sir, for your just a minute round. Thank you.
Right. I'm linking between last night, when we were talking about duty of care with regulators, yes. Because I think that there's a duty of candor amongst directors is the obligation under, a duty of care. This obligation is to act in the best interest of the individual when it's a duty of care. And a duty of candor is the obligation to keep the individual fully informed about the care when things go wrong. And I think that we might learn something from the British General Medical Council, who say on their website, I quote, "Every healthcare professional must be open and honest with patients when something goes wrong with that treatment or care causes, or has the potential to cause harm and distress. This means that healthcare professionals must, 1, tell the patient for where or where appropriate, the patient's advocate, care, or family when something goes wrong. 2, apologize to the patient where the appropriate or where appropriate, the patient's advocate, care, or family. 3, offer an appropriate remedy or support to put matters right, if possible, and to explain fully to the patient the short and long-term effects of what has happened. Healthcare professionals must be open and honest with their colleagues, employers, and relevant organizations, and take part in reviews and investigations when requested. They must also be open and honest with their regulators, raising concerns where appropriate. They must support and encourage each other to be open and honest, and not stop someone from raising concerns. At present, as I understand it, the duty of candor is an element of public law only. Somebody may be able to help me further with that. But is there not something that financial services firms in particular, where my interest lies, can learn from what works in the healthcare business?
Thank you very much indeed, Philip. Very, very, very interesting line of thought. I want to talk to you about the groups that we run. We have one particular group called the Global Financial Services Oath, which speaks to the idea that people in the financial services sector should take the equivalent of, or make the equivalent of, a Hippocratic oath, a commitment to do the right thing. And it kind of loosely ties into what Philip has been saying. Philip, you raised some very, very interesting points. We're going to swiftly move on to JB's point, and then I'll be bringing the session to a close. JB's point, which I find very interesting, is about the Quakers. JB would like to ask the academics, well, all of us, why the UK Quaker business models have fallen away and how that type of corporate governance compares to the ideas mooted today. I find that a really interesting question. Does anybody here have any insight into the Quaker business models? Because they've always been very multi-stakeholder, very enlightened, very fair, very balanced. Does anybody have any comments to make in response to JB's point? If we don't, then I guess we don't. JB, it looks like we can't really add much to that, but perhaps that's a point that you can bring to life at one of our future symposia, JB. That would be very good. Mike McGrath has got a point. Let's go to Mike. Thank you, Mike.
Andy, thanks. Yeah, it was an article I read that really shocked me in 1999. I was reading the Orlando Sentinel, and it was about a certain company that recalled their tires after so many people had got killed. And the actual tire company had worked out that they actually detected the fault, and they worked out that it was cheaper to allow a certain amount of people to die than it was to recall the tires.
Right.
I've just sent you the 3 articles there.
Right.
And I was completely shocked. And obviously, when you look at films like The Rainmaker, insurance about bone marrow, and when you think of the people that committed suicide regarding the financial crash, there was 2,200 people in the UK and Ireland committed suicide over financial bank issues.
I understand. Thank you very much. What a sad thought. What a horrible thought. I can just imagine somebody with a spreadsheet working out the probability of deaths and the cost of repairing the tires versus just coping with the carnage that it will cause. What a grotesque thought.
Well, if put it this way, if my daughter would have died in one of those vehicles, I would have certainly took restitution myself.
Well, there we go. Thank you very much for a rather powerful point at the end of our session. I'm going to invite Alan Mendelowitz, if he doesn't mind, to talk about the point he just put in the chat, and this will be the final session. Alan, if you're still with us, I think you are, please do come onto the screen and tell us about kibbutzes, if you don't mind, Alan. It'll be interesting to...
The kibbutz model was this community where corporate governance was a function of the weekly communal meeting. Basically, everyone was an equal stakeholder and everyone contributed and everyone benefited. And at the time they were founded, they also served a major national objective, which was to be at the pioneering forefront of the rebirth of a Jewish state in the historic land of Israel. And when the country was very, very poor and there was a great national challenge, the kibbutz movement thrived. There were 350 of them, 100,000 people lived. If you looked in the early days of the history of the state of Israel, those who volunteered at the highest level for national service came out of the kibbutz movement. The paratroopers, the elite commandos, the Air Force pilots, government leaders, military leaders. And as the country became richer and moved toward a first world organizational structure and economic level, the kibbutz movement went through a crisis, which basically resulted in the abandonment of the sort of joint communal corporate governance structure. And they moved to privatization. And they moved away from the old structure to a privatized version. There's still a handful of 10 or 20, maybe 30 at most, kibbutzim, which preserve the old values, but the rest of them have all been privatized. And it presents a challenge to any kind of alternative corporate governance structure that's built around really idealism. And self-sacrifice and some kind of notion of equity and social justice.
Wow, that's such an interesting point, and it makes me think of this saying, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome, which is a quotation from Warren Buffett's right-hand man. I've forgotten his name. Can't believe I've forgotten his name. Anyway,
Munger.
Charlie Munger. Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you. But my point being is that it may have been that some people were incentivized to become greedy, and that sense of greed took over and resulted in this collapse of a very kumbaya kind of mindset, which I guess would have dominated the way the kibbutzes worked. Somehow, folks, I think that's where we've got to get back to. We've got to find a way of getting back to that kind of we're all in it together mindset that I believe we've lost. I believe we're in real danger of losing that. I desperately hope it's not irreversible. I've got 3 kids, and I really am not happy about the idea that they're going to grow into a world where everything's about greed and me, and I. Maybe I'm getting a bit soft and a bit old and a bit kind of romantic in my mindset, but I would honestly much prefer if we lived in a world where everybody was a little bit more thoughtful about each other, everybody valued what really matters and didn't value so much about things that frankly don't matter. We're all spending far too much money on things that are actually extremely insignificant, and not enough time and attention on things that really do matter. That's kind of where this event has taken my mindset tonight. I want to go back to the world of kibbutzes and Quakers, and maybe I'm just becoming very old and very cynical. Who knows? But what I do know is that we've had some great speakers. We've had Professor Adam Lever, Professor Gerhard Schnyder, Dr. Shan Turnbull, Krzysztof Grabowski. Let's give ourselves collectively a great big round of applause. I know we've all tried very hard to bring to the surface the sorts of ideas that might just drive radical reform in relation to corporate governance. For the sake of our kids, grandkids, and their children, we really do have to somehow fix what's going on. There was a news clip of the other morning on BBC. I think the scientists are saying we've got 10 years to save the planet. If we don't kind of fix the stuff that's going wrong, we've got about 10 years left to do it in. Otherwise, we go past the point of no return. Ladies and gentlemen, these are pretty somber thoughts, pretty stark thoughts, pretty sobering thoughts, but they are the truth as I see it anyway. Let's just carry on doing whatever we can to try to make a difference. I thank you all. I salute you all. Thanks for being with us again tonight. And especially to Shan Turnbull, who got up especially early to share his thoughts with us today. Let's give ourselves a collective round of applause and pat on the back, and then we'll say goodnight, Vienna. Thank you all very much. Okay, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks, folks. See you next time. See you next time.